Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Test 1 2. You're all set. Thank you.
I can hear you, Angie. I can hear you, Angie.
Okay, well, that's good. My screen is freezing all the time. I don't know what's going on here.
I'm at the cottage in Dunville and looking at the lake, and seems to be working just fine.
Nice.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yes, yes, it would be.
Yeah, it's us muting you. We're trying to get things worked out in here. We got one more council member to bring in, and then we'll be ready.
Okay. Good enough.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for the delay. We had some technical glitches with getting some people online here. At this time, I will call our special meeting of Committee of the Whole 06-20 budget meeting to order. Introduction of addendum items. There are no addendum items this evening. Confirmation of agenda. I'll have Councillor Wells, Councillor Bodner move that. Any questions with regards to the agenda? Seeing none. All those in favor, please raise your hand. That's carried. There are no disclosures of interest tonight. And just so that, excuse me, the public is aware, I'm joined by Councillors Kalaloff and Councillor Bagu, and online is Councillor Bodner, Wells, Bruno, Danch, Demaray, and Beauregard. And we have our clerk and deputy clerk here this evening, our CIO Scott Louie, and Mr. Bowles, our Director of Finance, who will go through the whole budget process with us, as well as we have all of our department heads online. They'll be working from their houses this evening, but they are online for questions from council. So without further ado, we have two items. First item is the 2021 budget development process and city finances. To get this on the floor, I'm going to use Councillor Bagu to move that, and Councillor Kalaloff. Mr. Bowles, take that away, please.
Thank you, Mayor. It's a privilege to be with everybody tonight to talk about microphone on, red button. It's a privilege to be with everybody here tonight to walk you through the budget process that the city's been working on for the past several months. Being new here and not knowing all the questions we might get, I did bring a helmet in case the questions get too difficult that we'll be able to put on and hopefully deflect if required and get to the answers. So a couple things about budgets just to throw out there at the beginning. This is your budget. This is your opportunity to ask questions and help us as staff know exactly where you want to be. If you want to make changes, you'd like to provide additional comments or input. I'm going to try to go through the presentations and stop at many points in time. And then if you have questions at those points in time, hopefully you can bring them up as we go through. So having said that, if we go to the first slide, I guess, the agenda, we'll go through a pretty rigorous overview of the city and city finances tonight. A couple things to identify to everybody. I do have a couple acronyms in these slides. One is KPI, and for everybody to know, KPI stands for Key Performance Metrics. Another one that I use is LAMS. That refers to the local area municipalities. So that's when we take all 12 municipalities and create an average to see how we compare against them. I'm sure there may be some questions about the budget process. I will try to address some of those on page 5, and maybe that'll be our first stopping point, so council can ask any questions about the budget process and timing. I will point out that as we go through a number of presentations today, the big, I think, culmination at the end of the night is to look for council's thought process on approving a capital budget. The capital budget being proposed tonight is a 1% increase to the tax levy and 1.8% to the rate levies. We can have a conversation about what that means and alternatives that may exist as we go through. So if we go to the second slide, I'll just point out, if we look, thank you. Budgets are forward-looking, so I just want to bring out to council's attention as we build the budget, we as staff do bring forward our best assumptions. We use the facts, we use the information that we have to bring forward our best estimates of what the budget will be. I just highlight to council that as we go through that process, and you've seen in past years, actual results will definitely vary as we go through the budget process. And as those do, we'll bring those up to you. If we go to the next slide, budget 2021. Again, just a definition that I like to put forward on the budget. The budget's really a plan to allocate resources in advance. Really, we're trying to maximize the benefit to all city participants, residents, and stakeholders. We do have, according to the Municipal Act, a requirement to balance the budget, which I think intuitively for everybody here makes sense. So now if we move forward to the next slide, which is the budget timetable, This is the timetable that council approved back in July. I think it was report 2020-97. When I got to the city, there was a big question mark that was put forward. When were we going to do the budget? And we'd really like to have the budget process done before the end of the year. I proposed the budget timetable back in July and put forward that we'd start with the capital budget, move forward to the levy and user fees, and then we'd finish the year with the rate budget. If some people may be wondering, why do we normally start with the capital budget? Why do we move into the levy and then into the rate? I point out, and I put on these presentation here that you can see the Niagara region, you can see their schedule. It's very similar to many other local area municipalities in their process. And in fact, in this week and next week, a number of the municipalities in Niagara are actually going forward with their capital budgets to start these conversations like we are tonight with our council. I think if I was to highlight any other dates on this is what you approve tonight, and if you approve this, it still goes forward to council on September 28th, and you'll make your final decision on the capital budget at that point in time. And the same thing will happen with the levy budget. We'll have, and I've scheduled potentially 2 nights if council would like to have the 2 nights, and then we would go forward on November 9th to make the final decision. And then on the rate budget, again, we'd meet on December 2nd, we could meet again on the 7th, and we could look to approve on the 14th. That said, if going through the process, council wants more time at any point in time, you can have it. But I just want to identify that if we delay one part of the budget, it may move other parts of the budget. It's a bit like a puzzle. Staff is working on each section. So if we delay one section, we may have to kind of push the whole budget back a little bit. So if we move to the, to council, and maybe I'll ask the mayor how he wants to proceed. Do we want to ask any questions about that timing or the budget process?
Yep, I can, if you want to stop. Does any councillor have a question? Councillor Bruno? Turn your mic on, Councillor Bruno. Turn your mute off. I'll come back, Councillor Bruno, until you figure that out. Any other councillors? I can't see all the councillors. Can you put them up so I can?
There we go.
Okay, Councillor Bruno.
Thank you, Worship. I just wanted to say can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Just wanted to say to Brian, this is the first budget process I've ever seen where the director sort of set the table. To me, generally everybody thinks of budgets as just the numbers, but Brian, I have to say it's the first time in 20 years, private sector and public sector, that I've ever seen anybody talk about focus, building blocks, key policy development, community improvement, metrics, before getting to the numbers. And last but not least, to add in customer service. Like this is, I've only seen this once ever in my lifetime where someone has set the table about doing all the right things by the community staff and the citizens, and the numbers fall out the bottom, as opposed to it just being a numbers exercise. So that's all I have, Mr. Mayor. Kudos to the beginning of the process.
Thank you. Any questions to Brian at this time? As I said, I can't see everybody. If you could. Okay. Councillor Demery, did you have a question?
No, I don't. I'm fine with this.
All right. So I'm not hearing anybody else. Okay, Brian, move ahead.
Okay, thank you. So our next slide just reiterates the budget process to how staff is trying to interact with council. We started the budget process by asking council to have conversation with the directors. I thank council. Council came forward, talked to many of the directors on the early timetable. We've taken that information, we've done some analysis, we've tried to do some costing, and we've worked them into this capital budget. As staff, we believe we've tried to work in every request that was put forward in some way. In addition, if there is a question that we go through and somebody says, hey, we might want to make an addition or a deletion, we'll be able to do that. And this graph or this process map really just shows that we'll take that back as staff, make some adjustments, bring it back, and then bring it to you for approval. So I think on the next slide really goes to the budget format. Obviously, we've made a little bit of some changes, obviously with the timetable and what the budget and documents look like. I think the key reminder is, and what we had in report 2020-97 when we approved the timetable, is we're just identifying that we're going to try to break up even the operating budget, not just the capital budget, and break out the department costs, what we call self-funded entities, which are really entities that are being funded by user fees and charges, such as the Marina, Nickel Beach. The building department, interestingly enough, has legislation that it needs to find a balance, and if it finds a balance, it's supposed to repurpose those funds to offset future fees. So it really is a self-sustaining entity as well. We've broken it out into boards and commissions, also programs, grants, and activities. We want to really highlight that in a section in the budget that you'll see when we bring back the operating budget. And general government. So when we talk about the capital budget today, and I talk about the dollar figures that we're investing in capital, you're going to see those specific lines, those exact lines that when you look at the total levy or the total rate budgets, you'll be able to see that was the capital budget that you approved, and that's where it is being funded from. So we've also obviously included a new maybe look to the capital and related project budgets. So if we go to the next slide, really I appreciate the comments from the counselor on the budget focus. We've really, as staff, tried to highlight as we go forward customer service, technology, training and development, our core tangible capital assets. We do have to remember as we go forward that COVID-19 is with us and will be with us most likely going into at least the 2021 year. We've tried to take that into consideration when we put forward projects. And for us as staff, we know water and wastewater rates is going to be a priority of this council and how we can continue to invest to improve that system. A couple other items on this slide that I'd like to point out, and these are concepts that I think we're going to have to start talking about as a council, as a city. The one is generational equity. When we make investments, we have to be aware that who's paying for those investments, i.e. if we're creating costs today, but maybe we don't have to pay for them today, leaving that cost for a future generation to pay may not be our best alternative. And we'll talk a little bit about unfunded liabilities with respect to that, but that also goes, generational equity is also a question of how you utilize debt. For example, there will be times that we might talk about with the capital budget in the future where debt is an appropriate mechanism to ensure that users of service or users of a capital asset being put into place are actually paying for those costs over the time that they're using it, over the life of the asset. And we'll get into more detail on those concepts as we need to, as we talk about debt. The other concept that I think we'll need to talk a little bit more about as time goes on as we set user fees is the triple bottom line concept, which really looks at, there's not just an economic fee, but it's also how does those fees impact and how do those services impact environmental and social considerations. Social might be ability to pay, environmental might be does the fee cover appropriate disposal of, for example, waste that may be created with a service. So having noted that on the budget building blocks, I would move on to the next slide that talks about the key policy developments. And this is just to highlight that we've brought this to council before. Financial Services is working on a number of policies to put in place so we can regularly report to you the activities of the city around investments, which you've already approved, capital policy, the reserve policy, and a borrowing policy will all be coming to council for the September 28th council meeting for you to review and to review what regular reporting might look like on these topics. And then we'll look to bring other policies around travel, meals, professional expenses, and the delegation of authority later on in the year and into 2021. I think as we go into this next slide, and then maybe we'll have a moment to pause. As we've developed this budget, I just put forward to council that budgets are interesting in the standpoint that they're always at a point in time, and there's a lot of things going on around it. Right now, this city has a cruise ship consultant's report, a lake ends consultant report going on, a beaches, a marina. You're working on your strategic plan, and you may or may not have a lot of detail on this, but coming to council for November 23rd will be a review from KPMG that will help identify a number of areas that this city may want to look at to potentially find greater efficiency or save money down the road. So it is interesting. I just point forward to council that they are estimates. Budgets are estimates because there's all of these things going on around it. And as those things are going on around the budget, we're trying to get our best estimates of where we're going to end up multiple months and a year down the road. So I just bring this slide up to everybody to recognize there's a lot going on, and as we go through the strategic plan, as we hear from KPMG, and then as we digest all of that, staff looks to develop KPIs and maybe look at realigning how some things can be done. That process is going to likely happen between now and September 2021, and will have a huge impact on the 2022 budget. So before I move into KPIs, Mr. Mayor, perhaps we just pause and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bowles. Any questions from council? Just please raise your hand. I'm not seeing any. Maybe you just want to tell everybody what KPI stands for?
Sure. So KPI is our key performance indicators. I've identified a couple that I think from the financial statements this council might find interesting. So this first KPI really is about the allocations of where does our budget dollars go and where do we get them. So the first one being revenue. Port Colborne gets about 46.5% of our revenue from property taxes, 11.7% from grants, 32.9% from user fees. And user fees in this chart include water and wastewater fees, and then other, which may include investment income, it may include donations or sale of assets. But when you look at our comparator municipalities, others that are within the Niagara region, they actually get more in property taxes than we do, a little bit less in grants, a little bit less in user fees. They do get a lot more in this category called other, and that really is a difference between them having some government business enterprises like a hydro, whereas presently we don't, but we've used those funds to do other investments within the city. And then if you look at interest expense, you can see the same thing. Port Colborne, we spend a little bit less on salary, but we do spend a little bit more on environmental, which includes our water, wastewater payments, primarily to the Niagara region. And I think that's something that this council is well aware of and staff is well aware of. And when we get to the rate budget, we anticipate we'll have a number of robust discussions on that. And then the operating, which is a big number on this for sure, really breaks down everything from utilities to third-party agencies. For example, for us, the YMCA would be included in there where we do work with the Y. It includes grants we may give, it includes tile drainage, and it includes the repair and maintenance budgets. The only other thing to highlight there is our interest expense is a little bit higher than others, and when we look at our debt slides, we'll find out that we might have a little bit more debt than other municipalities. That doesn't really constrain us, but at the same time, it's something that we have to be aware of moving forward. So perhaps, Mr. Mayor, do you want to, there's about 3 KPIs. Do we want to stop after each KPI?
Why don't we go through all 3 and then we'll ask for questions. Thank you.
Okay. The next KPI is with respect to capital. I just want to point out, and we'll have a full presentation on capital coming up, but pay-as-you-go capital, which is really when you put aside dollars and you pay directly up front for the capital you buy, and then there's capital that we buy from borrowing. If you add those 2 figures together, you get $6.3 million that the city has in its budget. And if you're wondering the total size of the city, it's $40 million. So the city brings in $40 million every year and allocates it to a number of factors or a number of programs. And 6.3 million of that goes to debt and pay-as-you-go capital. Interestingly enough, and I think this council is well aware of because you've had these conversations before, amortization, we have regulations to fund up to at least amortization. And interestingly enough, if you take the 6.3 and in this graph or this slide I've identified, our amortization is actually less. So we're fully funding according to the guideline. The complexity with capital that I want to point out to this council is amortization is an old cost. It's what it cost to build the item potentially 30 years ago. New infrastructure doesn't necessarily, or replacement infrastructure doesn't necessarily cost the same amount today. There was a study done last year that showed if we were to actually maintain our infrastructure at full amount, we need to be putting $10.8 million into the capital budget every single year. That would leave us with a deficit right now of $4.4 million. So we will talk about a concept called catch-up factor. This city has used 1.25% of the levy in the last number of years as their catch-up factor. We as staff have recommended that we may want to move that to 1.5 and continue potentially in the future nudging that up further, recognizing this underfunding. I just want to emphasize it, if I can, on the next slide, the underfunding. And I know there's a lot of arrows on this, and so it may be a little bit complicated to follow. But the point is, we may be investing in this capital budget $6.3 million in capital, but only $3.6 million is actually going to fix capital that's already in the ground or capital that we've already purchased. That suggests that even on an amortization basis, we're still underfunding by $1.8 million. And I guess the question may be from council, well, why don't we just reallocate and cancel the other projects? Well, the complexity is the city's growing and there's a lot of needs with respect to other users, and as user groups change, to also invest in those projects. So that balance, staff has tried to recommend that balance, but it does just point to the fact that continued and ongoing investment in the capital budget is likely required, and council should anticipate it going forward. My next KPI really speaks to reserves. The reserves at the city, if you were to look at our total reserves, and I thought of how's the best way to compare it city to city. So if you take the city's reserves and divide it by the total revenue we have about 40% of our revenue covered off in reserves, versus the local area municipalities have about 54%. And you might wonder, well, why is that important? It really speaks to one very important factor of financial flexibility. Cities that kind of have a higher reserve to revenue ratio have greater flexibility if there's an issue that comes up, an emergency, a strategic investment that they have to put forward. It also provides them greater flexibility with bridging the gap between periods where the city's cash flow may be lower. Something that is notable to this city is we went on a line of credit 5 different times during the course of 2020. That's not to say that our finances are in a difficult situation. In fact, having 40% set aside of revenue is a fairly decent number. It just speaks to the fact that our financial flexibility may not be as strong as some of our peers, and if an investment or an opportunity came up, they may be more nimble to take advantage of it than us. And I think my last KPI, before maybe we stop, or I may have been wrong with my 3. I think I might have had 5. Sorry, maybe we'll stop after borrowing. My borrowing KPI slide really identifies that as of 2020, the city has $30 million in long-term debt. We're paying that down at almost $1.5 million every single year, and we've identified that in the capital report. I am forecasting on this slide that perhaps as that debt comes down, the city may want to, and we move forward with the CIP downtown project, we may want to continue to invest in water and wastewater going forward. Interesting to note, when we did issue the debt for Nickel Storm Sewer, we're in the process of fixing that as council gave approval for a 30-year loan. The indicative rates that existed as of today, if we issued the debt today, is 2.2% for 30 years. So we are, from an interest rate perspective at least, to help with affordability of our debt, in a pretty good spot to be able to do that. I have identified one metric that when we talk about borrowing policy in the future, I just bring to our attention. The amount, most municipalities have a greater, and as I pointed out in the last slide, a higher level of reserves. So the amount of money they have in investments, cash, and AR is more in line with the amount of money that they have in AP, long-term debt, and unfunded liabilities. So the two actually kind of balance. We're one of the few municipalities where we actually have a deficit in that area, although it has been improving in recent years. It is an area that I think as we move forward, we're going to have to balance our debt issuances and the amount of money that we're saving kind of for a rainy day to actually replace capital assets that exist. Maybe this would be a good opportunity to take a pause.
Thank you, Mr. Bowles. Any questions? Councillor Beauregard?
Through your worships, Director Bowles. So I have two questions. One in particular has to do with the LAM variable. When I know you were grabbing averages from them. Was there a lot of variance within this variable on these different KPIs?
Yeah, through the mayor, there is actually. Some municipalities have zero debt and have reserves that are at least twice the size of ours proportionally. So there is no one municipality that's the same as the other municipality in the Niagara region.
Councillor?
Yep, thanks. And to my other question is, could our reserve maybe be so low because maybe Port Colborne is doing some more capital projects that are on the capital budget than maybe other municipalities in the land?
Brian?
Yeah, through the mayor, I think the city is doing a lot of capital to try to improve itself. Whether that's the reason why our reserves are where they are, I don't know if I could definitively say. The reality is reserves get built up. It's not a one-day event. It's a 50, 100-year event. So to move the reserve figure for this council is something that's going to take many years if it was to look and take action to do so.
Councillor?
That's good. Thank you, Director Bowles.
Thank you. Councillor Bruno?
Thank you, Worship. Just two things, Brian. One is, when you talk about these the deficit in terms of capital spending and that, is it fair to say that we should really call that, for the purposes of this discussion, what you hear out there all the time and at the FCMs and AMO and everything, as the infrastructure deficit, which is huge across all cities, and particularly I would think in Niagara. And I haven't heard you use that term, but it's one that we're familiar with. Is that a correct analysis?
Yeah, through the mayor, these slides directly reflect the infrastructure deficit. And to this council, I would give you credit from my 4 months here and looking at what you've done over the last number of years. You've done a really, I think, progressive thinking job to actually continue to close this gap in the last number of years. But like all municipalities that are dealing with it, the gap is still fairly large.
Sure, yeah, across the country, I believe. Yeah. So the one thing that Eric alluded to, and you used the word peers, which I sort of look to, like we do with wage negotiations and everything else, is sort of like-sized municipalities. And so when you throw 12 municipalities in and come up with the average, you're throwing in a Pelham with all new construction and new underground, right? And so they don't have the expense, but they've still got the, similar taxes and a capital portion in water and wastewater. So, I think it's important to use Niagara as an example. I just take note of the fact that it's when you spread it across 12. It's not sort of maybe like size, and it might get lost in the wash there. And lastly, I just wanted to confirm this. In other years, Peter used to talk about debt borrowing, and with the province of Ontario has a 25% maximum. We heard that a lot about when Pelham was building its community center. The city has a self-imposed 20% limit. And I can remember when we were hovering in the 15, 16%, we were doing a lot of things. I understand it's now considerably lower. Could you give an estimate of what percentage we are, even though the province says we can do 25, we've self-imposed 20%. What was ours now, right, at the present time?
Through the mayor, our ARL, which is what they call the percentage that you're referring to, it's at 8%. When staff brings back the debt management policy, staff will recommend a 15% ARL, and we'd put forward that you would be able to, or well served to be able to, I think, finance the infrastructure that you'll likely need in the coming years with an ARL no larger than 15%. That may provide certain conservatism to the city, but nonetheless, I bring it to your attention, our ARL is 8%, and I think that's considerably lower than it's been in recent years, although the debt figure has gone up, interest costs have come down, and the city has continued to grow.
Great, thank you, Brian.
Any further questions from councillors online? Any councillors here have a question? Okay, Brian, move along.
Okay. The next KPI is really unfunded liabilities. I believe council has brought this up maybe before, or it may have come up at some point in time, but my expectation, it hasn't been talked about in any great length before by council or with a presentation. So I bring forward a couple facts with respect to the unfunded liabilities. We are in the process of finalizing 2019. When we look to finalize 2020, we will be finalizing it much earlier. But I do bring to your attention that the unfunded liabilities is at $9.5 million. We will be making some recommendations in our reserve report to start reserving for the unfunded liabilities. I will point out to council that I, as your treasurer, I guess, am putting forward that I believe that this is manageable, and we have some options for council to consider to perhaps bring this fund down or bring this liability down over a period of time without having to put all those dollars aside in reserves. The CAO and myself have had some conversations, and we are preparing something to bring back to council before November 23rd to have that conversation. Environmental liabilities, this is an area that has come up recently. The auditors, I just bring to your attention, we're asking about this. Right now we have no properties that have been identified, although we do have some properties that may be at risk, so we do look in the new year to actually do a review of a couple properties. In the capital budget, we have asked for some funds to be set aside for a specific property. Going forward to do some remediation or adjustment work on that. But at the present time, we do not have assessed or a requirement to actually record a liability for any environmental liabilities. And I just put in the bottom of this slide this concept called generational equity. This really is just the comment of if we are going to have these benefits that an employee may receive in the future, or they may get because they got hurt on the job, or we may have a property that has a liability. I put it to council that I think you can expect staff to bring forward the concept that maybe we should be setting funds aside for these so we don't make future generations have to pay for the costs that are being incurred for service being rendered today. The next slide that I have is really talking about property taxes. This is a slide I'm not too sure if councils had where your past presentations have been on property taxes, but for City of Port Colborne, we get about 77% of our property taxes from residential, whereas the local area municipalities get about 80%. On the commercial side, we get about 10.3. The local area municipalities get a little bit more than us. On the industrial, we are certainly higher. The other refers to things like pipelines and our payment in lieu, which were government buildings we might get some funding for. The next slide really speaks to, and this might be an interesting one for council as we go through the budget process, really speaks to the property tax and affordability. Port Colborne, if you actually add up the local, the regional, and the education component and compare it to the local area municipalities, our residents actually pay $770 less in taxes than the average home across the Niagara region. That might be of interest or news to many of us at this meeting tonight, but it is something, and we did have a third party outside of the city do this double check for us. And you might be wondering, you know, how many properties are kind of considered in our average calculation. When we calculate the average for Port Colborne, there's over 6,000 properties included, so it's not like it's just one house that's being included. And in fact, as we go through this presentation, we'll talk, I think our average house is around $190,000. And in fact, almost 65% of the houses in the city of Port Colborne are assessed at a value below that average, which is, I think, another interesting fact to share. And the next slide that I have here is really on assessment, and it's an encouragement for council to maybe go and have a look at this video. It was put together by and put out by the Niagara region. I'm happy to sit down one-on-one. We can have the conversation tonight or sit down one-on-one with any counselor and talk about assessment, how it works. If I was to give any comment to it, I think the important thing is to know that tax rates are not like your traditional income tax or HST, where it's set at 13%, and you pay it if the price goes up $100 or down $100, it's still 13% of the total price. The budget of the city, and to calculate what your tax rate is on a single house, we take the total budget of the city and divide it by the total assessment. So the rate changes every single year. Whatever, it's the city budget divided by the total assessment. If the city has really low assessment, the rate looks higher. And if the city has really high assessment, the rate looks lower. But if I was to flip back to the other slide, we have, and I would tell you, the lowest assessment in the Niagara region, and yet we still pay the lowest taxes on a blended rate for the average house. I know assessment conversations can be complicated. I'll leave it at that. If there are questions, we'll try to have those conversations. I would encourage council to maybe reach out if they want to have those conversations, or others, and we can do that. I have one more slide, but perhaps before we do that one, if there's any questions on those.
Any questions from councilors online? Seeing none, nothing from you guys in here?
Okay.
No? Okay. Oh, sorry, Councillor Clayliff.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mr. Bowles. Actually, he sent this video to me. It's short, sweet, helps you to really understand it. I encourage everyone to have a look at it. It's a great thing. Great learning tool.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Beauregard?
Through your worship to Director Bowles, I'm just wondering if the assessment's really high, does that mean that, is it possible that we can cut our rates a little bit? I'm just trying to understand it a little bit.
Mr. Bowles?
Yeah, so if assessment is really high, your rate is really low. If the assessment is really low, your rate becomes higher. It's how to explain it. I think best case, and I don't want to defer the question, but if it's possible to maybe take a look at the video, and we would have that conversation. And if council wishes to have additional education sessions for the citizens and the residents of the city, we can certainly schedule these down the road.
Councillor?
Thanks, Director Bowles.
Okay. Seeing no further questions?
So I just bring to council's attention this next slide. It is the water wastewater rates. As we're going into and staff is starting to develop these, I just want to point out to council that something that staff's identified in the last 2 years, the water rate and the wastewater rates we've identified on this slide have gone up almost 7 and 10%, but the region's charge to us has gone up 13% and almost 36%, and this is putting great strain on the system. Interesting fact that this council may like to know or maybe wanting to know is when it comes to wastewater, 90% of the bill that we charge our local residents goes directly to the Niagara region. So it's a big impact, and it is something that we're going to have to discuss as we bring forward the budget going forward. It's also the reason why when we talk about the capital budget coming up, the infrastructure needs study is, we would put forward as staff a very important part of getting towards tackling the water, wastewater challenges that the city is facing. We also put forward to council that we will be looking at options, and council will have the opportunity to direct us to consider monthly billing, as well as changes to the variable fixed rates, and certainly continued to improve funding to tackle some of the infrastructure needs of the system to reduce water loss going forward. Having said that, I thank council for the time for this presentation, and if there are any questions, I guess now that we've gone through it, happy to answer.
Any further questions on this? Seeing none in council, anybody online? Oh. You're all set? You okay? Okay, thank you. So with that, there are no further questions. I don't see any hands up. So that is the end of item 1. I did have a mover, Councillor Bagu, a seconder, Councillor Clayliff, that this presentation be received for information. Again, any questions? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand. And that's unanimous. Thank you, Council. We'll be moving on to item number 2, Corporate Services Department, Financial Services Division, Report number 2020-125, subject 2021 capital and a related projects budget. I'll have Councillor Desmarais move that and Councillor Beauregard second that. Mr. Bowles.
Thank you, Mayor. I think to move through the report, we'll utilize the presentation again, and we'll walk through that. So the agenda for the presentation is outlined and highlighted. I think we'll start on the first page being recommendation. The recommendation that we put forward is that this report that we provided be received and that the capital budget be approved. And I think it's key, and I want to highlight to council, if you do approve it, staff is asking for the ability to move forward with the projects immediately. We would like the opportunity to go out to RFP for the infrastructure needs assessment as soon as possible to get that project underway. It will take time, and by having this additional time at this point in time in the year will be beneficial to give us a head start on the project for next year. So the next slide being the process. So as we put together the 2021 capital and related project budget, I just highlight I do thank council for their interaction with staff, their ability to meet with us, talk about some of the projects that they wanted to include, receive our input and move it in. I think we've tried to highlight here just a need to focus on maintaining and improving. We are well aware of our own capacities, and we've tried to identify them in this recommendation and the financial flexibility of the city. The next slide really outlines the cost of the proposal. The cost on the blended rate would be a 1% increase or $34 to the average detached family home, which is valued at $196,000. And it'd be 1.8% on the water wastewater rates. Council might be interested to know that the total capital budget on water and wastewater is only 6% of all revenue received from water wastewater. So even if one was to say, I do not want to approve a capital budget for water wastewater, I want to make it 0, the maximum savings you would have on your rate is 6%. And staff would put forward to you that it may be the area that needs the most amount of investment going forward. My next slide really is just a highlight of source of funds. When we develop the capital budget, you get funding from a number of places. I mentioned the pay-as-you-go, which is basically paying up front for an item. You get that money from the levy and the rate budgets. We get grants from the federal and provincial governments. We also sometimes issue debt. This budget is not asking for any debt to be issued externally. And we have self-funding entities, i.e. the marina would have the ability at times to charge its fees, and those fees would help pay for debt. So basically user fees. If we move to the next slide, this slide I spoke to in the previous presentation. I've just kind of adjusted it here a little bit. Again, it just points to the fact that this total budget that we're putting forward might be for about $6.4 million in total. The amortization might be $5.4 million, which suggests that we're achieving our target and putting more money in than the amortization. But we have to remind ourselves that not all the capital budget is going to actually replace capital assets currently in the ground, which still leaves us underinvested. This next slide, I know it's detailed and I know the report is detailed, and I have sometimes been called a little too granular on my analysis, and I apologize for that. I'll point out, just for simplicity, the 2020 budget is the funding that was in the budget in 2020. We are suggesting that you would apply, instead of a 1.25% catch-up rate factor, move it to 1.5. The key on this slide, I point out, is we're recommending you start applying the 1.5 to your water wastewater as well, not just to the levy. Capital is needed in the water wastewater going forward. And then we would propose to take the construction CPI and increase the budget by the construction CPI, so that way we don't lose any inflationary dollars on the capital going forward. Then the next slide, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slides in, or 5 columns in, it has the 148 at the top. That slide is really us saying that some debt was paid off this year. You could either reduce the tax levy, but as we are suggesting, the total capital budget is the debt that you're spending, the money you're spending on debt, plus the money you're paying on pay-as-you-go upfront, paying for projects. We would recommend transferring those funds up into the levy for the time being, utilize them this year, and then as you may need additional debt, as we get through the projects with the engineering study that's being done for the downtown CIP, as we get through the infrastructure needs assessment, you'll have the funds there. You won't have to go back to the tax base to increase the tax rate in order to issue that debt. And the last column is really a function of staff reviewed the capital budget, and we've tried to remove all of the repair and maintenance. The capital budget used to have a number of debt service payments under the levy, under the pay-as-you-go funds. It used to have a number of lease costs. I think I said repair and maintenance. Subject matter experts were included in that. So what we suggested is we would remove those from the capital budget and move all of those costs back to the operating budget. There's no increase to the rate because of it. We're just going to be disclosing the expenses in a different spot of the budget. The last is obviously what the 2021 proposed balanced budget is. Now, I know that was a lot on that funding detail, so maybe I'll take questions.
Just clarifies for council and people watching, is taking that 148,000 and putting it away for any future borrowing. That over a 15 or a 20-year debenture would borrow approximately how much?
Yeah, so 150,000 annual payment would allow you to borrow $3 million, and that's an important number to know because as we look at the capital budget in detail, we are recommending 150,000 be put away, for example, in the water wastewater, or in the water budget, and that would allow you to invest up to $3 million in water projects that may help reduce the water rate long term.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions from councilors online? Councilor Beauregard?
Through your worship to Director Bowles, I'm getting kind of confused because usually we do water wastewater at a different time for water, and we're talking about water and wastewater in here and increasing. Are we making a definitive decision on that today? I'm just getting a little confused.
Brian?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. We have combined all the capital costs in this budget. So this is capital for the storm sewer, wastewater, water, and levy, all in here. And that's where we go back a couple slides. The impact to the rate is 1.8 on water wastewater rates, and the impact to the levy is 1% in total. We've essentially tried to strip the whole capital discussion to happen right here. And the primary reason for that is to try to provide clarity to what is being spent on in the water wastewater budgets on capital, but it's also to ensure that we get the infrastructure needs assessment, which is a combination of roads, water, and wastewater, all approved at the same time, so we can go forward with one bid.
Counselor?
Okay, are we approving a rate on water and wastewater?
You're not approving the rate. What you are approving is for these dollars to be put in the water wastewater budget, and you'll approve the totality of the water wastewater budget in November/December as we go through the process, and your rate increase will be determined in totality at that time.
Counselor?
Okay, so if we make it, once we make a decision on this, this is going to have a significant impact on the rate though, correct?
Well, it will lead to a potential increase. If council was to look at the rate and say you want it to be lower, staff would then look at potentially operating options and look to reduce there or provide other subsidy options.
Counselor?
Okay, that's all, thanks.
Okay. Counselor Bruno?
Thank you. I'm wondering, Brian, if it's easier to state, because I had the same question as Eric did earlier today. So it is a different order, but is it fair to say that whilst we're not dealing with water and wastewater rates, by approving this portion of this, the water wastewater capital at this time, that number, which is not part of the 1%, is going to migrate over to the day we do water and wastewater rates and be fixed in that discussion so that you can get started on the INS study and other things and get a running start on it. Is that fair to say?
Through the mayor, that is correct. And I would remind council that the stat that I had made earlier, and I apologize, there's a lot of stats and I know there's a lot of information tonight, but only 6% of the water wastewater budget is actually related to capital here. So it is a very small percentage of the water wastewater rate.
Okay. Counselor?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one other. Brian, maybe just a reminder, because at first blush, when you're building in CPI going forward for these construction projects and the money to be set aside in reserve so it doesn't get eaten away, that is not what the consumer price index that people see and say, well, inflation is only at 1%. That's the construction price index, which is usually a fair bit higher than the consumer price index. Is that correct?
Yeah, through the mayor, that is correct. And before 2019, that construction price index was ranging anywhere between 4 and 9% for the 4 or 5 years previous to that. And that becomes the complexity with capital. Well, the city was putting forward and trying to grow your capital by 1.25% every year. The CPI, when it was growing at 4, 5, and 9%, it was really eating away, and the progress you were trying to make was being lost because of inflation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Baggio, you're all set? Okay, thank you, Counselor Baggio. Counselor Beauregard.
Through your worship, Director Bowles, just a little bit more on the water wastewater. So you said 6% of it will 6% of the actual rate of the wastewater and water for this capital budget is 6%. What's the remaining 94%, I guess? Where's that allocated? So that some comes from the rate, some goes to the, you said 90% to the region, I believe?
Yeah, so on the water budget, 50% will go to the region, and on the wastewater budget, about 90% goes to the region. The remaining is operating costs within the city, including staffing to do the repair and maintenance. It is the repair and maintenance budget, which each of those budgets have repair and maintenance budgets of almost $300,000. So should council decide to, suggest that we need to lower the rate, one mechanism to lower the rate will be to reduce the repair and maintenance budgets, which is, one might say, analogous to reducing the capital budget, because much of that is going to the repair and the long-term nature of maintaining the capital asset.
Councillor?
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Proceed, Mr. Bowles.
So this next slide is something that I just want to bring to your attention, and I apologize for the complexity that this may come across that. But this year in 2020, when I got here, just after I got here, we got notification that one of our outstanding debentures was due. And I've identified it, and I apologize for reading it. It's a complicated thing, perhaps. There was a balloon payment that occurred, and when that balloon payment happened, we had to pay $135,000 on the fire truck and $433,000 on marina work that had been done 10 years ago. And the debt was structured for the debt to come due in 10 years and then to reissue it for another 5 years. And for council to understand that, that's a lot like your mortgage, right? When you go out and you borrow money for your house, and it might be for 25 years or 30 years, and every 5 years you might have to renew your mortgage. Well, our debt was set up the same way. When the debt came due, we made the payment. Now we have an opportunity, and I come to council. You could go out and you could do an external borrowing. We could go ask the debt markets to give us $500,000 back. We call up the Niagara region and we go into their debt cycle to do it. But I would put forward to you that there is some dollars left over in some debt reserves that you could pay off the fire truck, and the marina has in their budget to repay that loan over the next 5 years. It continues to repay from the user fees that it's charging boats and the people that actually dock their boats there. So as staff, I put forward to this council that our recommendation is you pay for the fire truck out of the reserve, don't reissue the debt, and we'll create an internal loan to the marina, and the marina will pay the city back with interest. So effectively, the users of the marina will be paying the city back with interest instead of paying the private sector back with interest. And we'll be bringing forward a report on September 28th to make that recommendation and decision. Ultimately, the city would be earning the 1.95% on the loan over the next 5 years instead of paying it to an external borrower. It's a mechanism for the city to reduce its debt and make a little bit of interest off of the marina user fees. So on that note, before I move on, I know it was a complicated idea to bring up, but it is a capital project, or it related to a historical capital project, and I just wanted council to be aware of it. I guess throw it to you, back to Mary. Is there any questions on that?
Yeah, I have Councillor Bruno, then Councillor Beauregard.
Thank you, Mayor. To Director Bowles, I concur with the way you've done this. Sitting on just as an example, sitting on the airport commission, we borrow money from the city, who gets it from debt markets, but we actually pay back the city. In that case, they actually add a little touch to the payment for what they're paying. But I think the significance of this slide is the difference between the fire truck balloon payment and the marina is that the marina is an SSE and was self-sustaining entity. Forever and a day, not in the last few years, the marina debt payments, improvements, et cetera, was coming out of the general levy and the general property tax. This is a continuation of, you are a self-sustaining entity, and if you keep getting paid off just by the taxpayer, you really have no incentive, not that you wouldn't want to as a prudent business manager or staff, to create more revenue. But every once in a while, when the rich uncle comes in and pays off your debt, right, it's a pretty sweet deal. This, to me, has more accountability to SSEs. I don't want to just single out the marina, but it is the first and foremost one that has the ability to pay for what it uses, because it has a captive and active market of users. And I think it keeps the market rates intact, because you can have whatever you want at the marina if you can pay for it. And I think that that keeps it at a somewhat equilibrium with the private sector. And I'm all for the way you've structured this, Brian. It's to me, it's the way forward when entities can pay their own way and don't really need the general taxpayer to pay for it. So this is great news and a great new direction. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Beauregard?
Through your worship to Director Bowles, I'm just curious as to the interest portion of what you were saying. It just seems a little redundant to have, like, in the end of the day, marina is part of the city, so it's just the city's paying the city with interest. I don't understand that.
Brian?
Through the mayor, the concept is really that it's not the city paying the city. Currently, the marina budget is based on what the users of the marina are paying them for the use of the marina. And that's a balanced budget or a slight profit some years, and it kind of fluctuates. And we're gonna have more conversations when we get to the operating budget. So the key here is they budgeted for it. It's built into the user fees of using the marina. They'll actually, those user fees are gonna, it's the customer of the marina that's actually paying back the city. It's not like the levy, it's not like the water rate, it's not a sewer charge. It is users of the marina paying the city the interest component. If we were to just pay it off, then, you know, the budget of the marina goes down, and one would look at the marina and say, well, maybe you should charge your users less. And I think what I would propose to this council is I would charge, or have that conversation at least, to consider charging the users the full cost of certain assets, and the marina would be one of those assets. This also, if you're a marina user and potentially interested in this, this will not change your fee, because you've been paying this fee every single year. We're just, instead of getting the money from an external borrower through the Niagara region, we're just going to lend it to you.
Councillor?
That's good, thank you.
Thank you. And the only thing I got to say, Brian, is I think you watched our inauguration going back after the election, because our challenge was to have staff think outside the box, and I think this is one of those true thinking outside of the boxes and bring it to council. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, so the next slide, projects by department. So we have summarized the projects by department. If you're wondering how do we know what projects to group under what, we tried to figure out who the project lead was, or the directors kind of figured out who the project lead was. This is the summary table to what you see in the report 2020-125, just to highlight where the funds are going. A couple things that it's harder to see maybe here, but I just want to point out, in some of the projects you'll see in the detailed summary, you'll see a grant is funding 80% of it and the levy funds 20% of that. It is something that we instituted for all the grants, and the rationale for that is a lot of grants have a number of items that they don't allow for the grants. There's certain restrictions. So by having a portion of a project on the levy or a portion of the project on the rate budget and the majority of it on the grant, it ensures we don't run into an issue where we need to pay for an item, but the grant won't let us pay for that item. The other thing I highlight here, and I think it's very important for us to understand, is there's an item called transfer to capital levy, and it's $225,654. It's basically 10% of the total amount coming from the levy to pay for this capital budget. And the concept here was we are asking council to approve this budget tonight and then at the next council meeting. And we fully understand that needs and wants and new projects are going to come up as time goes on. So this will be the fund that we will rely on as a city as we need to make additional investments, because as I started the budget process off with, a budget's at a point in time and things will continuously change. And this will allow us to adapt to that change as it happens, and we'll have the money there to do it. We've done the same with water and wastewater, and I would recognize or advise council that the 150,000, I think I may have mentioned, could allow you to borrow up to $3 million for water, and the 250 could allow you to borrow up to 5 million without adjusting those rates any further. And that could be significant as we go through the INS study and determine what we need to do to actually once and for all tackle the wastewater rates within the city and try to bring those down by reducing the water loss. So on that note, I think I'll go to the next slide just to identify some of the project highlights. This was in the report. This budget looks to increase the roads and roads maintenance budgets by 20%. Council may be wondering, well, why is road maintenance budget here when you told me you took out the repair and maintenance? There was a conversation and we eventually decided to leave road maintenance here. And the reason was, it was the materiality. Roads maintenance is around $500,000, and we want to be able to keep the highlight to council that this is the total budget for that. We've also, I've mentioned many times, the infrastructure needs assessment at the 750, funded 1/3 from wastewater, 1/3 from roads, and 1/3 from water. And we are trying to use grants as much as possible to fund some of that. We're also recommending as an important project, at least I'll highlight, and not to say that there's a lot of important projects, so I apologize, only a couple are highlighted here. Staff is recommending we actually take an aggressive stance with wastewater and look to start measuring flows and put flow monitors throughout the system and start to grid the city to fully identify where we're having infiltration that's driving to the region. And for this council to understand, staff in the region are talking about water, wastewater, and staff have a meeting, I think, not this Friday, but next Friday, and we're doing full tours of their facilities to have conversations about what more can be done before we get into the rate budget. So staff's very active there. We've identified a 20% increase to the sidewalk budget, and the Dane City, I think, trail, which has had some issues in the last year or two being closed down, it is in here at the 335. There is one other highlight that I really want to point out that my slides might not, but certainly was in the report. I'd like to advise or remind council that when we talked about where all the capital projects were, we identified that there was a number of projects that were put on, I'll call it hold, because they related to a potential ICIP grant. And council approved us to move forward with developing an ICIP grant. That grant is in the works, but we are still waiting for the federal and provincial governments to give us the final details to put it together. Staff want to identify that we, between reserves and previous levy money that's been set aside, and put the potential for a partnership, a third-party partner providing some grant funds. We have identified up to $3 million potentially that could be our matching funds. It was already identified in the last report. In our viewpoint, we've put forward that those projects that really relate to the community, that really relate to, I'll call it Nickel Beach, Cedar, whether it be trails, whether it be playgrounds, whether it be some of the washroom facilities at these, many of these would be funded through that grant. And again, the city having the ability to leverage over $3 million already it's set aside. So this budget actually is kind of interesting because we're asking for you to approve this budget, but there's actually a whole other component to the capital budget, which is this ICIP grant, which could be as much, if it was leveraged at the potential leverage we heard, could be as high as $15 million, which we wrote in that previous report, which would be a significant addition to this budget. So I do highlight, if council is saying, well, where is that park Where is that washroom upgrade? Where is that adjustment to Nickel Beach? It really is because, and just to remind council, and I know you're aware of it, but we have included it in that, or we will be including it in that grant. And we do have $3 million set aside. And should that grant not proceed, we'll be back in front of council with that $3 million to figure out what council wants to do with it. So it's not identified like in flashing lights in this budget, but it certainly is there. And there's a number of community projects that will be available to be funded out of that going forward.
So Brian, one thing I would ask that when you do meet with the region, that you do discuss their sewer mains, and that if there's any partnerships that they can get involved with us to find the deficiencies within the system, because I know there was some feeling from staff that there could be leaks on their end, which we're paying for. So as we're going out looking for our deficiencies, that they partner us to also do theirs at the same time. So please take that with our other staff to those meetings. I would ask that.
We certainly will, and we'll update council as we go forward.
Yeah, and if you can update both, obviously council, but particularly myself and Councillor Butters, so that when we take it to regional council, specifically as I sit on the Public Works Committee, that you know, those are things that we can bring to Public Works to that, and then also Councillor Butters can speak to it at a meeting, because she doesn't sit on that committee. She's busy enough with the other 3 committees, but at general council that she can at least speak to it if it comes forward.
Perfect.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Councillor Baggett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Director Bowles. A question, is there a limit on how much we should, I guess, dream on capital projects every year? Like, we have a lot of capital projects that we want to get done. We try and fit everything in all at once to get everything started a little bit. But is there actual number that we should realistically look at?
Mr. Bowles?
Yeah, through the mayor, there's no perfect number. I think realistically, the city will grow over time, and the recommendation that staff would have is to work towards, without a burden, to taxpayers, but try to work towards reducing the infrastructure gap. As you reduce the infrastructure gap, there also is that additional element that there's the operating cost side. And staff actually have a requirement through the TCA guidelines that we have to come back to council with in July, TCA being tangible capital assets in July, and start talking about the impact of adding capital assets or maintaining capital assets, and what are the operating costs to each of those assets. So this is something that I think will be addressed in greater detail over time. A perfect number I don't have today, but we might be able to get more definitive as we go through the work that's required by the province that we have to bring back to you as council in the summer of 2021.
Okay.
Thank you. My next question, we seem to be relying a lot on grants. Example, Cedar Beach washroom replacement, Bethel Hall replacement of, whether it's a furnace or a roof and stuff. But when the grants don't come through, come summertime, we still need that bathroom that's we found this summer was so incapable of handling the flow. You're just wondering, like that, you said we have the $3 million. So we're say city council is going to allocate that $3 million to prioritize those grants which may not have appeared.
Yeah, through the mayor, that is correct. Like, the reality is the ICIP grant, if the city wasn't successful, we'd still have the $3 million, and we'd have to decide how quickly we can deploy it and prioritize those projects to ensure residents have the amenities that they want. Specifically, I think you've noted one washroom that has had complexities, and it's not my decision to make, but it would seem reasonable that council might come back and ask for that to be fixed. Timing-wise, we will have to deal with that as we move forward. And if council wants to direct to add that to the capital budget today, we could. But right now, staff has suggested, let's see how far we can go with this grant process first.
One last question, Mr. Mayor. The first grant application, we have applied for it, if I'm not mistaken. Is there a approximate date we could sort of expect the answer? I know the federal and provincial governments, like, we're getting so far in debt. Like, I'm just wondering if all these are going to show up eventually, or all of a sudden the federal government, provincial government's going to say, hey, wait a second here, we're spending too much on COVID, sorry, but maybe next year.
Through the mayor, I can't guess at when the federal provincial government will have their guidelines out with respect to that grant. I will identify that through funding from the province, we did receive over $600,000 for COVID-19 relief, which was significant to the city, and that investment was, I think a strong indication that federal and provincial governments are looking to work with cities to support us as we move through the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic.
And just to clarify, Councillor, with regards to grants that Mr. Bowles highlights in a number of slides in both of these presentations, some of those grants are ongoing every year. Gas taxes, there's a fund that the province gives us based on our taxation here in the city. The moniker I cannot remember.
OMPF.
OMPF funds. Those do fluctuate from time to time. Sometimes they go up. Most of the province's numbers have either held or gone down over the last 10 to 15 years. Most councillors, like specifically Councillor Bodner and Bruno, remember some of these funds were quite extensive back in the early 2000s. So there's those grants that we rely on every year, and again, our staff do cross their fingers that we get the letter from the province and it's the same as the previous year. But then the grants that you were talking about are those programs that are released from time to time that we have to actually apply for, and in certain circumstances it could be a 50-50 split, 70-30. There's a grant out that what you were talking about is actually 80-20. We get 80 cents on the dollar from the feds and or through the province, and the other 20 cents we have to throw in ourselves. I do want to remind Council, though, that there is a budget coming up shortly, and if you have read the tea leaves coming out of Ottawa, I think you're going to find that the federal government is in the spending mode, which we've seen over COVID, that you're going to see programs that they will look to fund coming out of the municipalities. They do have provincial buy-in on a lot of this stuff. So some of it they may go on their own, or some of it they will share with the province. So be cognizant that going into latter part of this year into 2021 that there will be funds available. So I think that's something that we've always urged staff to keep an eye out, is that we can spend 20 cents and get 80 cents from an upper tier. I mean, at times some of us don't like the huge debt that upper tier governments can get into, where we're not allowed to do things like that as far as deficit finance. But if they're going to spend it, whether it's in Coquitlam, BC, or St. John's, Newfoundland, or Quebec City, it's going to get spent. So you better get your hand out and get your applications in so that the citizens of Port Colborne can at least reap those benefits of their tax dollars going up to upper tier levels. So, but I'm sure Brian and his staff, as well as our other directors, are very cognizant of what's coming out from the province, or from the province, but primarily from the next federal government budget. Councillor Cleo.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Director Bowles, do we have the ability as a city? We've identified some very major projects that we know that we need to have done for next year, and I guess you mentioned like washrooms at Nickel Beach, certain things that we know we need to have in place. And I guess I'm just looking at timelines and how long it's taking to get any of these projects done because of supplies not being available, or different things happening along the way that extend them out. Do we have the ability as a city, and we've got an application in for a grant, we haven't heard, are we able to start with the funds we have? If it's something that we know, whether we get the grant or not, we're going to have to do it anyway, we're hopeful we'll get the grant, are we able to start and then still reap the benefits of the grant? Or once we start, are we disqualified from receiving the grant? Do we have to wait?
Through the mayor, I have not experienced a grant from the federal provincial government that funded work that you'd already done before they kind of announced it and you signed off on it. And I've always seen where you've had to come to an agreement, sign off on the grant before any costs started to be counted.
I just hope we could order things ahead of time. Thank you.
Yeah, I've never seen that in my
I
17 previous years here. And Scott's been a CAO, not
Yeah.
only here, but in other municipality, and Brian worked at the region.
I never saw it either. I just
Yeah.
was hopeful that maybe with COVID and because it's just taking so long to get
Yeah.
things done. And I know even if we get the okay, the difficulty is getting the work done in time for what we need it done. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, any questions online? Councillor Bruno?
Yes, Your Worship. Councillor Bagu's point, I wouldn't say the word would be I take exception with, but I don't see the planning, the full-throated planning of projects that we need doing as necessarily dreaming big. And I also don't see that our projects rely on grants. What I see is that a municipality should have a long-range list of projects that they want to do. And in terms of the dollar amount, put them out there in today's dollars, knowing that you have $3 million to spend with doing nothing more in raising the funds because it's sitting there in reserve. I guess I would say to throw in potentially Councillor Clayliff's point, is if you have, to me, the $3 million should be matched with the projects that you most need. So grant or no grant, you have identified that those are the ones that you can do. If we get the maximum, then having the dream list, which I wouldn't call that, but I would call it a list of things you'd ultimately want to do. The $3 million gets you 12 million of someone else's money. So I think you have to look at the whole thing as, what are you going to reserve? What are you going to do first? And the rest is the additional stuff, so that I would look at the world that we're not relying on grants to do the first $3 million worth of work. And if the grants come, it bumps off of that into 8, 10, 12, potentially $15 million. So I think we should be dreaming big, but spending conservatively if we've already got the $3 million. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Council. Okay, continue, Brian.
Thank you. So my last two slides, I think they're the last two in this deck, refer to the community improvement project that we have in the downtown. It's just to identify that we have, and we are recommending a change in funding. This project at best will not hit the ground in the construction process until 2022. So what we've done in this budget is we've said we have $1 million set aside for it, and in previous councils, just to be clear, council had actually set aside another $1 million. And instead of just letting that money sit in the bank, we've allocated it to projects here. And then when we're done the full engineering study and the architectural work, we would then look to 2022 to fund, how are we going to fund this in 2022? I've identified that one example would be, some of it would be from debt. Others will be certainly grants, such as the gas tax will be an option, as well as the Infrastructure Ontario monies that we get. So we will just look at the funding mechanism in 2022. Staff is just recommending that we don't let the funds just sit there and not continue to move us forward on other capital items that are needed.
Okay, any questions to that? Councillor Bodnar.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. Bowles. Just so we're absolutely clear here, the original thinking was that we would make sure we had all of our ducks in a row, including those conceptual drawings, everything we needed so that if a grant come in, we'd be ready to go. Is this going to affect that at all? Are we in any danger of missing a grant if we spend this money on something else?
Brian?
Through the mayor, no. We are still moving forward with the RFP process to get an engineer and to do the architectural work, which was the original plan. It's going to be done on the larger scale, which was the original plan. This just acknowledges that that plan to do all of that work will take time. At the same time, we're going to be doing the infrastructure needs study, and we want to make sure that that information is coming to the engineers to make sure we actually design and build, you know, what is in the long-term interest of the city.
Councillor Bodnar?
Just what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So you're at the end?
I am at the end.
Mr.
Thank you.
Bowles? Okay, Council, let me go back here. So we do have a motion on the floor, which was moved by Councillor Desmarais and seconded by Councillor Beauregard, that the Corporate Service Department Financial Services Division Report number 2020-125, subject 2021 capital and related project budgeted be received, and that the 2021 capital and related projects budget as outlined in Report 2020-125 be approved, and that the projects identified in the 2021 capital and related projects budget can begin immediately where feasible. Any further questions with regards to that? As Mr. Bowles said, it is going to be coming back to us at the 28th meeting, correct? 28th meeting, Mr. Bowles?
The next council, if the next council is 28.
Yeah, so the
Yep.
28th, just
Yep.
so I know that. I see Councillor Wells has questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to Director Bowles. When I went through the details on what you had issued out to us, I found a lot of verbiage, but I didn't find any real substantial association to the KPIs or to financial justifications of some of the needs for these capital items. So is there an opportunity for us to ask those questions of you in regards to specific items?
Bowles?
Through the mayor, the KPIs that we have right now are at a very high level for the whole city. I think I've made mention that as we move through the strategic plan, we'll drill down into KPIs and hopefully we'll be able to align all capital projects to strategic initiatives within the city. Tonight, you have all the directors of the city online and they are prepared to answer questions on these projects should a councillor have any questions.
Councillor Wells?
The numbers of questions that I have would probably take us over midnight. Can this be done independently with the various directors up until September 28th?
The answer is yes for that councillor. So anytime a councillor wants to sit down with either Mr. Bowles or senior staff, no issues with that, and bring those questions forward. That's perfect.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wells. Any further questions? Seeing none, please raise your hand. All in favor of the motion that's on the floor. And that is carried unanimously. And Madam Clerk, I believe that is the end. I know. It's too early to adjourn. No. Yeah. Motion to go past curfew. Council, both those that are in the chambers and those online, thank you very much. All of staff that joined us this evening. It's probably the first time that we didn't go after staff individually on things, but I know Brian has put a totally different way the budget is being presented this year, which is good. It is fresh. Nothing wrong with that. And we know that questions will be coming to you, staff, through counselors on a one-to-one basis. We also thank the members of the public that have joined us this evening. And anytime the members of the public have questions, please don't hesitate to email staff or counselors or the mayor's office at any time, and we can bring that forward. So we appreciate that. At this time, I move that the meeting be adjourned. Thank you.